The Museum of Flight is the largest independent, non-profit air and space museum in the world. With over 175 aircraft and spacecraft, countless artifacts, millions of rare photographs, a world-class library, and numerous exhibits and experiences, the museum and its dedicated team of docents bring mankind's incredible history of flight to life. In this video, we will visit the Great Gallery, the Red Barn, and the Apollo exhibit. Here you will see the only drone carrying Lockheed Blackbird, a piece of Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Model 10E Electra plane, full-motion flight simulators, the actual long-lost rocket engine parts from Apollo 12 and 16, an early Soviet spacesuit, the original Boeing aircraft factory known as the Red Barn, and much more.
My name is Ted Huetter. I am the public relations manager here at the Museum of Flight in Seattle. We are one of the top tourist attractions in Seattle, and we build our museum around that. We know that not everyone that comes here is going to, they don't come here because they're an aviation or space geek. A lot of them do, but mostly they come here because it says something about Seattle and Seattle history, because it's such a long, over 100-year history now of aviation and space. So there's that. And also, it's a fun place. There's flight simulators. There's all kinds of room. If you've got kids, they can run around. There's playgrounds for them. It's 5 buildings over 23 acres. In that regard, it really kind of sets us apart from most aviation museums that you go to in this country, which are, wonderful collections, but they don't have the capability or the staffing or whatever to have a real research facility and research library and archive like we do. We are more like the Smithsonian Institution when it comes to that. We have a dedicated collection staff that archives materials, catalogs materials, just like, going to the British Museum or Smithsonian. So it's called our Great Gallery. It's probably what most people see the first thing when they come to the museum. It's right off the lobby. And if you don't have a lot of time, it's a good place to start, simply because it gives a general picture of really the first 100 years of flight. Everything from this replica of the Wright brothers flyer that was made for the centennial of that event back in 2003. So it's as accurate as a replica, actually a duplicate of the Wright flyer can be. They made 3 of them. They made them to be flyable. This one was kind of the pick of the litter, so they decided not to try to fly it, because the ones they did fly didn't fly very well. They crashed a little bit and things had to be rebuilt and stuff. So this one has all the parts, all the moving parts, could be a flyable aircraft, but it's left in this condition, so it's pristine. And also this gallery has really got some superstars in it that everyone likes. I mean, this plane, this is one of the Blackbirds, the Lockheed Blackbirds. The most famous ones are SR-71s, and they all pretty much look the same, but this one's a little different. It started out before the SR-71s. It's based upon the A-12, which was the earlier version of the Blackbird. And it also has something on top that you're not going to see on an SR-71, and that was a drone. So that was another program that was tested by Lockheed and the Air Force. And long story short is that it was just a little too much James Bond. This is 1960s. The idea would they'd be cruising along at a couple thousand miles an hour, launch the drone. The drone would fly out over the territory they wanted to spy on, take its pictures and a pre-programmed course, fly back, drop the camera package, which would be picked up in midair. And then the drone would self-destruct. That was the idea. It's all pretty cool. but it turned out to be a tragedy because one of the early test flights, the drone misfired, hit the tail. Blackbird started breaking up, crew ejected, and this is over the Pacific off the California coast where they were testing it, and one of the pilots was drowned. So they only made 2 of these drone carrying Blackbirds. This is the surviving example. So that's the only place you're going to see one of these. One of my favorites, if I could choose one to have as my fun airplane. It just looks cool, so it's got good looks. Fighter plane of the 1920s, so it was made to be tough. It's aerobatic. I like doing stuff like that. Boeing had its own numbering system for its designs, kind of starting with 1. So the designs were called models. So this was the Model 100. So there are things that you have to do if it's going to be on exhibit, draining fluids and things like that. That gives you a good time to clean things up and dry them off. But, you know, some planes go on leaking fuel or oil for years. This plane is our Lockheed Model 10E. It is the same sort of plane that Amelia Earhart was flying when she disappeared with Fred Noonan in the Pacific back in 1937. And this one was formerly owned by a woman named Linda Finch, who bought the plane, and this was made in 1935. And she had it restored to as close to the condition that Earhart's plane was as possible, including the internal fuel tanks, the exterior paint job, the windows being done over. So it's pretty much a duplicate of Earhart's plane. And then she flew it around the world trying to trace the path of Earhart as much as possible, but making a successful flight all the way. This is the only known piece from that airplane. The way we know that is that when she first attempted that flight, it was in Honolulu, and it was going to go a different direction around the world. Well, the takeoff went awry, so she had a crash takeoff. And here's a picture of that. So, you know, it wasn't anything major, but, you know, things were broken, especially underneath. It probably wasn't too unusual for one of the folks like here that was helping with the rescue and the salvage to take home a souvenir. It's been verified as a part of that airplane. You can find a place on this plane where it matches, and it was kept in the family, in that person's family, for generations. And it was that person who really wanted to find out, well, you know, did Grandpa, was he just telling stories, or is this true? So no, it was verified as best as could be that it's from that plane. Everything matches up. I mean, he was there. There aren't very many places where you can actually sit in the cockpit of an SR-71. Any pilot, you know, of this era, because this is really a 1960s kind of cockpit. It's round dials, you know. This is not a glass cockpit. Despite the space age look of the exterior, you're flying it at the edge of the atmosphere at 3 times the speed of sound. You're heating up. The nose here is heating up to some places, you know, over 500 degrees, you know, so it's cooking, and you need to have absolute belief that this is not going to break for any reason. Well, these are fantastic flight simulators because they're they're full motion. So as you can see, you can do rolls and everything in this thing. Um, and you choose your airplane. You know that you have a choice between World War One type fighters, World War II, and jet fighters. Probably the jets are the most popular because then you've got rockets coming at you, and you've got things to shoot down, and it's more. You can play it like a video game. Like, I'm sure if you're good at video games, you're going to be good at this. But you're flying it like a real airplane, and it's for two people. So usually it'll be assigned of, like one person is the pilot and the other person is like the doing the shooting, if that's what they're going to do. This is one of our spaceflight exhibits. We have several, but this one is a look at the race to the moon back in the 1960s. So it's kind of begins with a little bit of early rocketry, but quickly transitions into the space race of the 1960s. Just about everyone has probably heard of Sputnik, because that's what started it all. That was the first artificial satellite. And this is what it looked like. I mean, the original eventually burned up, but this is as close as you can get, because this one was an engineering model that was made in the Soviet Union. That's where it came from. It was at a research institute academy for years after that. It actually had some insides to it that we figure it could have been used as a satellite if they wanted to launch it. So it is really as close, and there's only one other one known to exist. So this is really, really rare, and it shows what the original space race was all about. This is also an interesting thing that you're not going to see at very many places, is that the early Soviet spacecraft was just a big ball, as opposed to ours, which were more of a cone and had some controllability to them, not much controllability with a sphere. But the very first ones, the cosmonauts were in this, sort of like an ejection seat. So they did not land with the spacecraft in the first few flights. They actually ejected once they got through the atmosphere and were down to like 20,000 feet or something like that. Well, in the atmosphere, they would eject and would have to parachute the rest of the way down. So now we're into something that's a little more Apollo-centric and landing on the moon. For the 50th anniversary of that flight, so in 2019, we had the Smithsonian exhibit here. So we had the command module, Apollo 11 command module, and other artifacts. It was a time that, I thought about it an awful lot, relived it a lot, and met countless people who were a part of it, or they're too young to have had that experience. And there's really nothing else today that can compare, because it was such a different world. You didn't have social media, you didn't have computers, you didn't have any of that. Find a TV set if they wanted to watch it, whether that's at home or someplace else, or listen to it on the radio, read about it in the papers. When you say it brought people together, that's probably one of the most common things that, like the Apollo 11 astronauts heard as they traveled around the world. It's kind of a goodwill flight. Is that no matter where you were in the world, people said that, we landed, meaning, if you're Mexican, we landed. You're, Canadian, we landed. Looking at people on Earth as a collective we, and that's a pretty interesting phenomenon in itself. Okay, we live on a planet that's in space. This is classic because this is an Apollo 10 spacesuit, so including the bubble helmet. And this used to be John Young's, who's, he's kind of a superstar of astronauts. He flew on everything except Mercury. He wasn't one of the original 7 astronauts. but he flew everything after that. You know, he went to the moon, he flew the space shuttle, he flew Gemini, flew Apollo, all that stuff. The Apollo command module, most of the ones that you see look scorched and damaged, and which is all very cool. This was the first production model though, so it was never flown in space. It was used for training, and that's why it's so nice and shiny.
My name's Neil Woodward. I'm a docent here at the Museum of Flight. My docent is just a fancy name for tour guide, but basically I know a bit about the artifacts we have here, and we actually have some real special ones here in the Apollo Gallery. I'm going to start with this one because it's the biggest. This is the this is like actual flight hardware. One of the questions that we get a lot here in the museum, or at least I get from our visitors, is like, what of this is real and what of this is a mock-up? This is a real rocket. This was supposed to fly on Apollo 16, and it actually failed a test, and so they hauled it off and replaced it with a spare, and was supposed to fly again in one of the later Apollo flights that were later canceled. So it was never used. But like, this is like a real engine from a Saturn V, and the thing that's cool about it is you can get an idea of the scale of it. The Saturn V had 5 of these things, not just one. It was necessary in order to get that larger rocket up into orbit, and you get a appreciation for the complexity of the engineering that went into it by looking up at the pumps and the turbo pumps and everything that actually made it work. Now, the other thing I like about this is what I call before flight. Over here, this is after. This is, again, real flight hardware. This is from Apollo 12 and Apollo 16. Now, what happened is, of course, the lower stage of which these F1 engines were on is jettisoned. Fuel tank is empty. They jettison it so they're not dragging it along, and it just crashes into the ocean and sinks. And NASA didn't have any idea where they landed. They just, they didn't care anymore after they were released. And so what happened is, so that there's these Saturn V first stages for every one of the Apollo flights is in the bottom of the ocean somewhere in the Atlantic. So what happened is that Jeff Bezos has a whole bunch of money, and Jeff Bezos, he's an aviation geek. He is a total space and aviation geek. I'm surprised he went into Amazon and not aviation. That's why he built a space company. But in any case, he formed an expedition to go out and find these things. And there was no record where they were, but they looked at like weather data and winds and everything and ballistics and figured out where they probably were and found several. So this is from Apollo, I think this one was Apollo 16. This is the turbopump package, and this is the combustion chamber from Apollo 12. And so these were from the real rockets that took people to the moon. They were at the bottom of the ocean for about, 40 years or so, maybe a little more. And he dragged them up and donated a couple to us. And what's interesting is you can see this part here is actually, if you look over here is this part here, and this part down here is this combustion chamber portion up here.
This is what is known as the Red Barn. This is the original Boeing factory. Come on over here to get a look. So what we've done, so it's restored, but what you see is largely the original building. It's not like a replica of the building at all. No, this is our largest artifact. The main story in this building is this was the original museum, by the way. When this was moved to this location, it was located originally a couple miles from here. So in the late 70s, they moved it to this location, and the museum, which was pretty much a small collection near the Seattle Center, was moved here, and this became the Museum of Flight, which has gotten bigger ever since. But most of the exhibitry in this building now pertains to the Boeing story and the story of Northwest Aviation. As you can see, these belts go around like this. So back in the day, you would have had these belts, operating machinery the length of the building. So it's a very efficient way of, turning machines that are located in different spots or have different purposes. The planes, they're originally mostly wood. So it was wood construction, then they started making more and more metal structures, and then eventually transitioned entirely to metal. Yeah, this building was used up through World War II, and even beyond that in some ways. So it saw everything from, the earliest kind of flying machines, where is one of those models like this that were made here, to the jet age. It was turning into just an old building that the company wanted to probably demolish when it was rescued by Bill Boeing Jr., who really was the force and the money behind having it saved. And they started making airplanes during World War I in 1915-16. This part of the building is our space for temporary exhibits. And the one we have now, it's called Home Beyond Earth, and it's all about space stations and living in space. So moved out of 1909, and now we're moving into spaceflight. So a lot of these objects are on loan, from NASA and other organizations. Some were specially built for this. This model of the International Space Station, we worked with students at the University of Washington, and these engineering students put this model together. They fabricated all the pieces, and then they worked with NASA to coordinate it with the actual movements of the solar panels that are happening right now on the space station. So you can see them move a little bit, very slowly. This has an interactive component that when you start the exhibit, you can pick a little card, it's all free, and you personalize it so it has your name on it. You choose what name you're going to be, little avatar, all that kind of stuff. And at these stations around the exhibit, you just touch that and it'll ask a few more questions about what you want to do on the space station. At the very end, you come to the museum's space station, station TMOF, and when you log into this, you can see all the other people that have logged into it, and who else is going to be on board with you. So like we've got, last I heard, there's about 10 or 12,000 people on board. And so you can see what they like, what their professions are in space.